the content of my course more effectively. Um, I spent a lot of my time looking at the active learning research literature, and some things in that literature are very clear. It is very clear from the research literature that active learning classrooms are more effective for getting students to learn pretty much anything you'd ever want them to learn than a traditional classroom is. That type of first generational active learning research is no longer an interesting research question. We know the answer to that question. But there's a whole lot less research looking at one type of active learning versus another type of active learning. So even for people like me who spend a lot of my time looking at the active learning research literature, I would say we could use some more research on that question. But the comforting message from tonight's workshop is I have come across a number of studies that suggest that in terms of students mastering course concepts or course content, that quick and simple active learning techniques are just as effective as more radical techniques like flipped classrooms. That is, if you're struggling to transform your class to teach in some radical way, my suggestion from this evening is there are very few research-driven reasons why you need to be that radical. Right? If your goal is to get the students to learn the content of your course and the fundamental concepts of your discipline, quick and simple active learning can be just as effective as flipped classrooms. Now, there are some questions that, there are some learning outcomes like problem solving that are probably better taught in problem-based learning techniques. There are probably some skills like teamwork that are better taught using cooperative learning, right? When you're looking for certain outcomes, you should find pedagogies that give students practice and feedback in those skills. But in terms of course learning, if you're struggling with active learning and you think that you need to do something radical, the message from tonight is you don't. That is, in terms of student learning, quick and simple techniques can work just fine. Okay. I do want to make one distinction because this evening the workshop is on active learning in online environments. And there is a little bit of a distinction in terms of how active learning is defined in online classes. In a face-to-face class, the focus historically has always been on what happens during class, what happens in class. And there's a reason for that, because people are, for their research, are trying to distinguish active learning classrooms from traditional classrooms. And every class has homework, and homework is active. So the focus has always been not on what the student is doing anytime, but what the student is doing in class. When you look at the research in online classes, some of those online classes are asynchronous, meaning the students are never together at a common time. There is no class time. And so it makes less sense to ask about what happens during class, because in fact, there is no single class time, right? Because of that, the focus when we talk about active learning in online classes tends to focus on active student engagement, and the emphasis is not on when the activity is happening, but just what the student is doing. All right, so that emphasis on in class tends to go away when we talk about active learning in online classes for that reason. Okay, but the focus is on active student engagement, and the definition of active student engagement is very similar to the definition of active learning. That is, the key difference is students in your class cannot all the time be passive recipients of knowledge. They must be doing something actively, at least every so often, to engage with the content of your class. The other kind of mild distinction that shows up when we talk about active engagement in online classes is it's not just activity, but it tends to be some type of interactivity, some sort of back and forth, okay? And that back and forth tends to have three different flavors. So as you're thinking about what we mean by active engagement in an online class, and you're trying to think about what options you have for engaging students, you might think about three broad categories of ways to engage students. Category one, student-student interactions. What can I do to get my students to interact with each other? Okay, and again, the answer will be lots and lots of things you can do. Some examples would include discussion boards, where students are having a back and forth conversation around some course-related question that you have posted. You might have students peer review each other's work. in an online class. And so students would be discussing with each other back and forth some conversation about their course content. Or you might put students together in teams to work on some common assignment. And during that common assignment in an online class, the students would be talking to each other back and forth about that course-related assignment. All of those would be examples of ways of having students do something to engage with each other in an online class. Okay. The second type of interaction that you might think about is student-teacher interactions. That is, some of the things that people miss in online classes, some of the things that I miss with you right now, especially since I can't see you, is one of the things that drew me into teaching is I like to interact with people. I like to help them learn. But in an online environment, students can feel socially disconnected and isolated. And active engagement techniques help with both of those. The easiest way of getting students to feel like they're interacting with real people is to have them interact with real people. So the first category of active engagement strategies were how to get students to interact with each other. The second category of interaction strategies are what are things that I can do that would facilitate my students interacting with me as the instructor. Okay. So things that would do that include live question and answer sections where in an online class you make yourself available where students can ask questions and you will answer those questions. So there's a back and forth communication around the course. You may not think of an online quiz as an active learning technique, but it checks all the boxes. If you post an online quiz, you're asking the students a course-related question. When they complete the quiz, they are giving you their answers. And when you grade the quiz or give them feedback, you are correcting their mistakes. And so that's a sort of back and forth, which qualifies as a student-teacher interaction. And then, of course, discussion boards, which you might think of as student-student interactions, are not entirely student-student interactions because as a professor, you can and should be a participant in that discussion board. All right, so that's the second category of things that you might think of doing to engage students in your class. The third category of interaction strategies are student content interactions. That is, the student doesn't necessarily have to be interacting with the person. Doesn't have to be a student, doesn't have to be you as the instructor. The students can be interacting with technology around course-related content. So for example, if you have an interactive tutorial set up, that can be interactive, but the student is interacting with technology and not with you directly. If you set up some sort of online simulation where you ask the students to make a prediction and then run the simulation and see what happens and then give them some feedback, that's an interaction. Or again, simply putting up a practice test and having students see the solution is a type of student content interaction because the test is asking students a question. The students are then answering those questions for themselves and then checking the solutions online. Okay, so let me pause. The workshop tonight is trying to clarify what active learning or active student engagement means in an online class and what are some examples of that. So I've tried to define it and give you three broad categories of ways to engage students in an online class. Does anybody have any questions about any of the definitions of what we mean by active learning in online classes? Okay. If not, let me get you to use the chat window again, which is I've given you a very broad overview of active student engagement strategies, and I've given you three different categories. There are literally hundreds of things that you could do as an instructor that would qualify as an active engagement strategy. So in the chat window, what I want you to tell me is, how do you choose when you are picking a way of actively engaging students in your class? How do you pick an effective method? How do you pick a good way of actively engaging students in your class? What are the criteria that you think would make sense for picking an active learning strategy? Take a moment and in the chat window, give me some guidelines that you can think of that would help you choose how to come up with a good activity. I'm looking for ideas. Again, Give me some guidelines. Again, you have, as an instructor, you have literally hundreds of choices, all kinds of things you could do. How do you pick a good one? What's some criteria or guideline you would use for picking a good one? There you go. All right. And again, the reason I'm asking is it's not necessarily a trivial question. So I want you to think about it. I got a couple of answers so far. I got people looking at the class profile, thinking about who's in class. I have someone thinking problem solving. The first one is actually my favorite. So let me give you my three personal criteria that I use for coming up with active learning techniques. That is, my suggestion from the workshop tonight is when you're trying to figure out an active learning technique, do one or all of these three things. One, do what the very first suggestion was, which was when you're trying to figure out an effective way of actively engaging students in your class, the thing that you should remind yourself is the point of active learning is not activity, it's learning. People learn anything, any skill at all, whether it's learning how to ride a bike or speak Arabic or solve partial differential equations, it doesn't matter. People learn any skill through guidance, practice, and feedback. So the main criteria you should use for giving activities in your class is your instructional objectives. If your goal is to get students to master fundamental concepts, you should ask them conceptual questions. You should ask them to define concepts in plain language. You should ask them multiple choice concept questions. If your goal is to get them to be more creative, you should ask them to do something that stretches their creativity. Ask them to brainstorm solutions to a discipline-related problem. If your goal is critical thinking, you should ask students to do an activity that makes them practice critical thinking. Whatever it is your instructional objective is, that could be the natural basis of the activity, right? Again, I mention that because people think of all kinds of creative or kind of convoluted ways of coming up with activities. But if you have a list of instructional objectives, those make perfectly good activities. Okay, so criteria number one, ask the students to do what it is your class is designed to teach them to learn how to do. Okay. That being said, one of the things that the research does tell us is that not all engagement strategies are equally effective. Some categories of engagement strategies really are better than others. And one of my favorite frameworks is the ICAP model from Nikki Chi. It's referenced in one of the papers that I sent you. So let me go through what that framework is. And again, the point of this workshop is not to make you an expert on this particular framework. The message is to get you to think about when you are doing things to engage students in your class, some categories really are more effective. What does the research say about that? Okay. So in this framework, there are 4 different categories of engagement strategies. One is you might ask your students to do what I'm having you do right now, which is listen to me lecture or watch a video. Faculty often think that proponents of active learning think that lecturing is evil and that you should never lecture. And that's not what we think. And that's not what the research says. Proponents of active learning think that lecturing can be an effective tool, but it can be overdone. And the message is sometimes what a student actually needs is the right lecture at the right length, at the right level. It's just that that's seldom what a student always needs. That is, you should break your lectures up. So there's nothing wrong with having your students listen to you lecture or watch a video in an online class, but it tends to have the lowest effectiveness compared to other things you could do. Okay. The second category of activities that you can do to engage students in your class is to ask them to do something where they're active. And active in this framework has a very specific meaning. It just means the students are doing something, but that something is not creating anything new, right? So for example, if a student pauses a video and copies the notes directly from the whiteboard on the video, they're not passive, they're doing something, but they're not creating anything new because they're just copying the text verbatim, okay? So there's, that copying is not creating anything new. And that's not bad. That activity wakes them up, and it tends to be more effective than not doing anything active, but you could do better. The third category of things that you might ask your students to do are constructive activities. And this means just what it sounds like. A constructive activity is where the student is doing something active, and that something active creates something new. Because learning is a process of sense making. When you're learning something, you are trying to make sense of information by connecting that new content to your existing understanding. So if you ask the student to summarize the lecture, that is both active, but it is constructive as well. That summary didn't exist before. If you ask your students to come up with a concept map illustrating the content of your course, that's constructive, okay? And that tends to be better. Finally, the highest category of engagement strategy based on a fair chunk of research are interactive strategies, where the students are actively doing something, and that something is creative, something new, but they're not just creating it on their own, they are co-constructing it. So getting students to not just summarize the lecture, but to agree on that summary, not just come up with a concept map, but agree on that concept map. That type of engagement strategy tends to promote the most learning, because that back and forth that happens during the interaction tends to clarify things in ways that make it effective. Okay. All right. So I don't want you to lose the main point. The main point here is, as you are thinking of ways to actively engage students in your class, the first recommendation is to ask them to do something directly driven by your instructional objectives. The second suggestion is to think of a framework like this and to pick at least some engagement strategies that are constructive and interactive. Again, the message is not you should never have your students be passive. I'm having you be passive right now. The message is every so often break that up and ask them to do something either constructive or interactive. Okay. All right. Any questions about that framework? All right. I think that framework is fairly new, and I want to stop and do a quick activity with it, which is I have 5 activities on the slide. Having your students watch the professor do a demonstration, have your students take notes, have your students highlight text from their textbook while they're studying, have the student answer a question posed by the professor, and doing a think, pair, share activity where you ask the students to do something on their own for a minute and then turn to a neighbor and agree on the answer and share their response. I want to put you in breakout rooms, and in your breakout rooms, I would like your breakout room to agree on which category of engagement each of these activities is. Is watching a professor do a demonstration, is that an example of a passive strategy, an active strategy, a constructive strategy, or an interactive strategy? See if everyone in your breakout room agrees on what these activities are. Does anybody have any questions before I put you into breakout rooms? If not, someone's going to get you to put people in breakout rooms, and I will try to circulate around to see if you have questions. These questions are on the activity sheet. So Salam too, if you could put the link for the sheet in the window again, that way people can
Okay.
find the table and don't have to remember it.
I am putting the link for the worksheet and references, so you can
Perfect.
see it.
Thank you. All right.
I
So
am
click on
opening.
that link, and then Salam will put you into breakout rooms and see if you can complete that table.
Okay, I will start the breakout rooms.
Thank you.
Dear doctor, everybody is in breakout room and I will send you in one.
All right, is everyone back? Great, thank you. All right, welcome back, everybody. Are you seeing my slides again?
No,
Not yet.
you are not sharing it, no.
All right, let me go do that again. All right, seeing them now?
It's coming, yes, yes.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay, let me go through my answers and then answer any questions that you have. Okay, so watching the professor do a demonstration. That one is, I would characterize as passive on the part of the student. I mean, of course, the instructor is being very active and the instructor is not lecturing, but that's not active learning because the student is passively listening to and receiving whatever the instructor is delivering. So from the student perspective, the student is being passive. Taking notes kind of depends on what you mean by taking notes. If the student is literally copying verbatim the notes that the instructor is putting on the board, that would be active but not constructive because the student is not creating anything new. If the student, while taking notes, is paraphrasing or summarizing, then that paraphrase or summary did not exist before. The student had to construct it, and so that would be characterized as constructive. Highlighting text with a yellow marker while studying would be active, but not constructive, because the student isn't creating anything new. And in point of fact, while this is a common studying strategy, it's a particularly ineffective strategy. Answering a question posed by a professor would, of course, depend on the question. But in a typical question, that you would ask the students to not repeat something verbatim, but to come up with their own answer. And that coming up with their own answer would qualify as a constructive activity, assuming the student is coming up with that answer on their own. And a think, pair, share activity is a classic example of an interactive activity, where the students are first thinking about their individual answer and then turning to a neighbor and agreeing on that answer. And that process of agreeing, they are co-constructing their common answer and clarifying things. And so that would make it interactive. Okay, those are my responses. I see that someone has a question. Claude, what's the question? How can I help you?
Thanks, Prince, for that. The question is the higher level of activity. Would this contain the lower levels? For example, I would have thought that if you are doing think, pair, and share, it will naturally involve some level of activity, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in general, yes. That is, so by definition, it's not passive, right? If I am co-constructing knowledge with a partner, I'm not passive, and I am constructing something new, right? So I am doing a constructive thing, but I'm taking it one step further. Right? And again, I think you can see that taking it that one step further, is not surprising that leads to more learning. Or in that process where you do what you're doing right now, where you're having a back and forth with somebody, trying to co-construct an answer and co-understand the answer, that process tends to add clarity and depth to what you've learned.
Yeah. So the point I'm saying is that the questions, maybe some of them will fall into more domain. If you are think, pair, and sharing, you are interactive, but maybe you'll be constructing something as well.
Sure, but the way the framework works is you always go with the highest thing that's in that category.
Okay. Okay.
So if you think it subsumes constructive, which it does, but it's also interactive, then you would characterize it as interactive. Okay. But again, as I mentioned in some of the breakout rooms, I'm not trying to make everybody an expert on Mickey Chi's ICAP framework for this evening. That's not the goal of our session together, because none of us are cognitive psychologists, and that's not our focus. The piece that I want to get across is, as you are confronted with all the things that you could ask your students to do to actively engage them in your class, the second recommendation I have is to think about a framework like this framework, and to remind yourself to not just give students something to keep them busy. Don't just give them something to make them active, but give them something that would make them construct meaning, to make sense of things, either on their own or with a partner. And doing that tends to result in more learning. Okay. Were there any other questions about either the ICAP framing or the second recommendation that we're making?
Yes, I have a question regarding the fourth activity. So, is there any circumstance under which the fourth one can be interactive?
Sure. And then again, if you ask your students a question and said, turn to a neighbor and come up with an answer, that would be constructive. If the student and you engage in a back and forth dialogue where the student is coming up with an answer and using you as the sounding board and their partner, then that could also be interactive. But there needs to be some process where that student is sharing their ideas and getting feedback with somebody else and coming to a better understanding because of that interaction. That's the key element.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, great. That's recommendation number 2. Let me give you my third recommendation for how you can pick active engagement strategies for your online classes. All right. I don't know you yet, and you don't know me. All right. So, but I would say that, like many of us, I did not choose to teach online. I was dragged kicking and screaming into an online class environment because that's the way the world made me go. And for people like me, and maybe some of you, your response might be, my online class is doomed to be a pale imitation of a face-to-face class. It's just not going to be as good as a face-to-face class because, you know, face-to-face teaching is what I love, and this is what I think it's better. I would say there's a lot of research that compares face-to-face classes to online classes. And that literature is both huge and very consistent. That is, in general, there are no statistically significant differences in learning outcomes between online classes and face-to-face classes. And again, that can be a controversial finding, but there are literally dozens and dozens of meta-analyses that reach that conclusion, and that conclusion is a fairly consistent conclusion. Part of the reason is, while there are some things that are better in a face-to-face class, there are honestly some things that are better in online classes. And so my third recommendation for picking activities is to think about ways in which online classes are honestly better than face-to-face classes, and to try to choose some of those, right? Some of those are just kind of mechanicals. For example, I'm with you this evening because we're teaching this online. That is, I am not inclined to travel all the way to Saudi Arabia, but you can interact with different people in an online class than you can in a face-to-face class. But there are also some techniques that honestly work better in an online class. For example, I want you to compare a live discussion with an asynchronous discussion board, and to think of all the ways that an asynchronous discussion board is actually better. For example, in a live class, especially in my discipline of engineering, where the focus is on content coverage and we never feel like we have enough time, we almost never give students enough time to participate, right? So as a result, only a small number of students actually get to say anything in an online class. And only a small number of students are comfortable talking out loud in an online class. But in an asynchronous discussion board, every single person in that class has an opportunity to participate. And the participation rates really are better in an asynchronous board than they are in class. Again, in a live class, when I'm teaching my thermodynamics class and worried about getting to every single equation of state on the planet, I never give students time to think. I ask them a question and I give them 10 seconds, if they're lucky, to think about their response. But in an asynchronous discussion board, people can take as much time as they need to think about their answer and to post a thoughtful answer. And so I get better, more reflective answers. And I get some people who are shy or introverted or struggle with language to post things in an asynchronous discussion board that would never say things in a live class. Finally, all of us have probably had the experience where there's a small number of people who are comfortable talking in class and sometimes dominating the conversation and talking over others and cutting them off. But in an asynchronous discussion board, that can't happen. In an asynchronous discussion board, no one can talk over somebody else. Okay, so the point here is not that everyone should run out and use asynchronous discussion boards. The point here is, as you are thinking about ways to actively engage students in your online class, in addition to picking activities that are driven by your learning goals, in addition to picking some activities that get your students to be constructive or interactive. Also think about things you can ask them to do that would honestly be better in an online class than they would be in a face-to-face class, all right? And the asynchronous discussion board is an example of something like that. Your online classes don't have to be worse, they can be just as good. All right, let me pause. Any questions about any of that? All right, if not, let me do a reflection and give you a break. So what I've tried to do with you in the first half of this workshop is to both define and demonstrate some simple ways of actively engaging students in online classes using Zoom. So we've done some breakout rooms where I asked you to look at some activities and categorize them in the ICAP strategy. All right, that was a student-student interaction where you got to have some back and forth with each other. It was a student-teacher interaction where you got to ask me questions about the ICAP framework, and all the interactions were around the content. And we used a simple breakout feature in Zoom, okay? I also did a stretch poll, right? Is stretching active learning? And I used the poll feature in Zoom, okay? Both of those are examples of active learning. The poll was a student-teacher and a student content interaction. The point of those engagement strategies tend to be formative assessment, which is, I've covered something, like I covered the ICAP model. Did you get it? I defined active learning. Did I lose you? Did I confuse you? So a lot of what we're doing with simple active learning techniques or simple active engagement strategies is, after I've covered something in class, I will do a brief activity to try to firm that up and to give students in the class some feedback. So that process tends to be a very effective way of promoting learning. So when you're thinking about active engagement strategies, a lot of it is providing helpful feedback to students to see if they got it. Some other examples that we've talked about and done tonight is I've used the chat feature in Zoom. And that chat, in chat, I asked you, like, what is active learning? In the chat window, give me what your definition of active learning is. And I've used the yes/no poll, which is I showed you a spectrum of active learning techniques. And I said, are the things on the right, are they generally better than the things on the left? All right. Both of those types of activities were diagnostic assessments, which is I didn't teach you anything before I asked you those questions. I was just trying to figure out where the class is. Does the group have a pretty clear understanding of what active learning is, or are they confused about that? Do you have the strong predilection that more radical techniques are better, or are you fairly neutral on that? And based on your responses, I might spend more or less time on a topic depending on where you are. So a lot of the active engagement strategies can be used to just diagnose where the class is, to figure out, as the instructor, where you want to spend more time. If I see that almost all of you think that more radical techniques are better, I'll spend a little bit more time talking about how, yeah, maybe that's less true than you think it is. Okay. Finally, all the active engagement strategies are meant to break up the lecture, because especially in an online environment, it's just hard to pay attention to anybody for any extended period of time, right? And it's meant to kind of help keep you awake and to clarify things so you don't feel overwhelmed, right? So all of these three goals tend to be some of the things we're looking for when we're using active engagement in our online classes, okay? You have been good and stayed awake for at least the last 55 minutes. And my own personal experience is nobody can pay attention to a Zoom meeting for any extended period of time. So I want to give you a 5-minute break. And my advice is, don't check your email. Don't check CNN to see what's going on in the world. Get away from your computer and go look at something else and come back in 5 minutes. And I will pick up again in 5 minutes from now. Go take a 5-minute break and I will see you in 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully most of you are back. I will say one of the eerie things, again, with online teaching is, especially in a Zoom environment where people aren't sharing screens, is that you really do feel a little bit more disconnected, all right? So let's say I'm hoping you're back, but I'm ready to pick up again and follow up with the second half of the workshop. While the title of the workshop was called Active Learning for Busy Skeptics, the reality is most of the people who show up to workshops like this are not terribly skeptical. And so I don't spend a lot of time going over the research on the effectiveness of active engagement strategies. But if you are skeptical and you would like to see that research, I sent to you right before this workshop 2 very recent literature reviews on the effectiveness of active engagement strategies in online classes. And if you'd like to see similar research for the effectiveness of active learning in face-to-face classes, I'm happy to send that to you as well, though some of that's already cited in those papers. The only thing I'll say here is, it's a fairly conclusive and convincing body of literature. You know, even the quick and simple things that we're talking about tonight, which are in some cases embarrassingly simple, and in some cases embarrassingly mild variations on a traditional lecture, have been shown to result in greater student learning. And so I've simply provided here a quote from a meta-analysis on the effectiveness of active engagement strategies, which you can read for yourself. What it basically just says is, we've looked at this question many times. Does active engagement work in an online environment? And what the quote says basically is that student-student, student-teacher, and student content interactions all result in or correlate with enhanced student learning, better student attitudes, and better retention of students in academic programs. That is, it may seem remarkably simple, but in point of fact, all of these things work for pretty much all of the outcomes that we care about. All right, and so again, the message for us as practitioners is we simply need to do them. We don't need to be crazy about it. We don't need to be hysterical about it. We don't need to be radical. But all of us should be making some efforts to work some degree of active engagement strategies into all of our classes, including our online classes. Okay. So what I haven't done with you so far tonight is actually given a whole lot of very specific examples of active engagement strategies in classes. And so again, my presumption is that many of you who show up to a workshop like this are looking for very concrete ideas for how to actively engage students in your class. And I've done some of that, but let me try to do a little bit more and then give you a chance to explore that a little bit more deeply, both on your own and in small groups. So if you were looking for simple activities that engage students in an online class, one common example would be a minute paper. Who already knows what a minute paper is? Is there anybody that's willing to put into the chat window their definition of what a minute paper is? Or if you've never heard of a minute paper, in the chat window, tell me you've never heard of a minute paper. There you go. Some brave person is willing to say no idea. Okay, so maybe it's not as common as I thought. Great, so a minute paper is what it sounds like. A minute paper is a common active learning technique where about 2 minutes before the class is over, you would ask students to take out a piece of paper. In an online class, you might ask them to go onto the Moodle discussion board. And you would ask them to identify the muddiest or the most confusing point from that day's class. So even in a face-to-face class, even if it's a large class with 200 students, I don't have to read all the responses. So I might collect their responses as they walked out the door. And as I walk back to my office, I might read the first 20. And I might see what comes up the most frequently. And I might walk into class the next day and say, it seems like a lot of you were confused about the difference between collaborative learning and cooperative learning. Let me take a moment and clarify that for you and then move on. Okay, so a minute paper is a quick and simple way of getting some feedback from students about what they're confused about. And it's a total win-win, meaning you look fabulous as a professor who cares so much about your students and their learning that you bother to ask what they're confused about. And you read their responses and you address them. But it's a win for the students too, because they were confused about something and then you unconfuse them. So it's a quick and simple technique. It works perfectly fine in live classes and it works just as well in an online class. Another simple active learning technique is things that you can do to actually make your class more high level. So again, I spent a fair amount of my time looking at educational research. And a lot of that research involves asking faculty about their own teaching. And unfortunately, what you find when you look at that research is faculty lie, or faculty are not terribly honest. That is, faculty say things like, my class is all about critical thinking, or my class is all about creative thinking. But when you actually look at what goes on in people's classes and look at the sorts of questions they ask on their assessments, what you frequently find is that there is very little critical thinking and very little creative thinking. So one of the questions you might think about is, are there quick and simple active learning techniques that could get my students to be both more creative thinkers and more critical thinkers, that would give them practice and feedback on being both creative thinkers and critical thinkers? And the answer is, of course, there are. Some of the common techniques are brainstorming and critiquing. So in brainstorming, so I'm a chemical engineer by training. I teach classes in separations. What I might say is, Saudi Arabia is a desert. They need water. There's a large body of salt water right nearby full of water. I might ask my students to brainstorm all the ways they could think of to generate fresh water from ocean water. And of course, my students can creatively come up with all the things that an engineer can think of. Membranes, reverse osmosis, evaporation, multiple effect evaporation, sedimentation, chelation, all the things that you can do as an engineer to separate potable water from salt water. So I could get them to practice being creative. Critical thinking is fine. There are 12 different things that you could do. Using solid evidence and sound reasoning, tell me which one of these techniques do you think is most promising and why? Right? So all of you aren't chemical engineers, you all teach different disciplines, but all of our disciplines have multiple ways of solving our disciplinary problems. Right? So asking your students to come up with creative answers to whatever your disciplinary problem in your course happens to be can generate some creative thought. And asking them to choose and justify which among those options is the most promising and why is an example of critical thinking. So a simple active learning technique, and it pushes the higher level thinking that we say we do in class, but don't do as often as we say we do. Okay. Another simple active learning technique that you might do is you might stop, pause your lecture and say, take a minute, either on your own or with a neighbor, and see if you can identify the main ideas from the last 40 minutes, or the last 3 days, or the last 2 weeks. Pick any time period you want. And then ask your students to support those main ideas with some of the details that you've covered in class. So an active learning technique to get them to identify and firm up the main ideas that you're trying to get them to learn. Okay. The thing that I want you to notice from all the examples I just gave, all of those examples are things that I typically talk about in my workshops on active learning and face-to-face classes. And the message for you is, if you're teaching in an online class and your class happens to be synchronous and you're already using active learning in your face-to-face classes, then the message is there's almost no active learning technique that you're doing in a live class that doesn't transfer pretty easily to a synchronous online class. That is, you may not need to do anything different than what you're doing now. It will probably work just fine. That being said, there are some active learning techniques like think, pair, share that honestly don't translate as naturally to an asynchronous class. In an asynchronous class, when people aren't in class at the same time, asking your student to turn to a neighbor and discuss something is a little bit more awkward. So some active learning techniques work very well in asynchronous classes, and some active learning techniques do not. So the type of active learning technique that you choose for your class will depend on the environment that you have for your class. Okay, but again, if you happen to be teaching synchronously, then you may simply transfer the techniques that you're already using. Okay, I'd like to stop talking and give you a chance to look at a broader menu of possible options for ways that you could engage students in your class. Again, my predilection is people who show up to a workshop like this would like to leave with some very concrete, specific examples of techniques that they think would suit them and their personality and their style. And that last piece is important. There are plenty of active learning techniques that simply don't match my personality and style. And as a result, I don't use them. Okay. So what I want you to do is to look at a bunch of things you could do to actively engage students, and then pick ones that honestly suit your personality and style and outcomes in class. So if you would, I'll ask Solomon to put the web link in. I see he's already done it. That is, if you open up that link, you will see two fairly extensive tables of things that you can do to actively engage your students in an online class. The activities are broken up based on what their educational goals are, whether they're student-student, student-teacher, or student content interactions, whether they're passive, active, constructive, or interactive, and whether I think they fit naturally into an asynchronous environment or whether I think they don't. All right, so there's some guidelines for different flavors of activities. What I like, my recommendation is, you don't need 68 different ways to actively engage students in your class. And in point of fact, if you tried doing 68 things, it would overwhelm you and confuse all your students. At the same time, you don't want to do the exact same thing every single class because that gets boring. My own personal experience is, it's nice to have somewhere between 3 to 5 active engagement techniques that keep it manageable for you, not so confusing for your students, but not boring. So my goal for the next 10 minutes is to have you first on your own and then in small groups, make sure everybody can identify at least 3 active learning techniques that you honestly think would be a good a good match for you. All right, and to do that by looking at the suggestions in the table. Does anybody have any questions about what I want you to do? The next 3 to 5 minutes on your own, quietly going through the table and marking the ones that are a good fit for you. Okay, I'm going to be quiet for 5 minutes and I'll let you do that. If you have questions during that process, post them in the chat window and I will try to answer them. Okay, my clock, it says it's been 5 minutes, and all I'd like to do right now is to put you in groups to have you share ideas and to improve each other's ideas. And so hopefully for the last 4 or 5 minutes, you were looking at some of the options and identifying some things that you think might work for you. When I call you back from the breakout room, I'd like everyone to have kind of like their favorite active learning technique that they're willing to put in the chat window. And so the point of the next breakout activity is to have you talk about some of the ideas that you think you like and why you like them, and to try to get some of the people in the breakout room to kind of expand and flesh out their own ideas. So I want everyone to kind of talk about your favorites and see if you can give each other some good ideas for either increasing or improving some active engagement strategies in an online class. Does anybody have any questions of what I want you to do for the next 5 minutes in the breakout room? If not, I'll ask someone to put you in the breakout rooms, and I will circulate around again and try to help you if you're confused with anything.
Okay, I'm starting the breakout rooms. Should I? You are muted.
Thanks. Would you call everyone back?
Okay.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. If you would, take a moment and stick your favorite active learning technique in the chat window. Good. I'm always curious kind of what people gravitate towards. Okay, let me do the last topic that I want to cover in the workshop. And again, thank you for all the ideas that you're sharing in the chat window. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think a lot of the things that people want to talk about in a workshop have to do with their concerns. And actually, the diffusion of innovation has become one of my research areas, because the reality is we have 20 or 30 years of good educational research on what to do in a classroom to be more effective. The biggest problem we have now in terms of improving education is not that we need more research on what works. What we need to figure out is, how do you get faculty in large numbers to actually use what the educational research says we should be doing? That's the more interesting research question right now, and that's the larger problem. When you poll faculty about what the barriers are that are inhibiting them using the educational research and things like active learning, you see a variety of things, but most of them have to do with time. So the two most common barriers that you see reported in the literature are, one, I'm busy. All right, how much time does it take to prepare these things? Because I'm still struggling with my teaching and just trying to keep my head above water, especially figuring out this online teaching thing, and I don't have time for a whole bunch of new headaches. The second concern that comes up regarding time is the syllabus, which is, I have a lot of important things to cover. I don't have time for these cutesy turn to your neighbor activities. If I have to do 68 activities every class, I'm never going to cover all the stuff that I need to cover in my class. Those two are the most common concerns that faculty have, So let me try to address those two, and then I'll take any other concerns that you have and try to talk through them. Concern number one, how much time does it take to prepare? I would say the answer is it depends. All right. There are certainly types of active learning like flipped classrooms and problem-based learning and cooperative learning that really are time intensive in terms of your preparation time. So I am not going to tell you that active learning never takes a lot of preparation time, but I am going to tell you that there are plenty of types of active engagement strategies that require very little preparation time. And I've tried to highlight those tonight. So for example, how much time does it take to prepare a minute paper? The answer is very little. I simply have to ask my students, what's the most confusing thing from today's class? The preparation time is as close to zero as you could want. How much preparation time does it take to put together a poll? In Zoom, honestly, even a Luddite like me can put together a poll in less than 5 minutes. So if you're really concerned about preparation time, and that is a common concern, and it's a realistic concern, my recommendation is don't adopt a radical time-consuming active learning technique. Adopt a simple one like minute papers and polls. Based on some research that I've shared, and I could share some more, there are plenty of reasons to think that even those simple techniques, which sometimes sound embarrassingly simple, can be just as effective as the more radical techniques. So you don't need to feel embarrassed about doing quick and simple things. Quick and simple things can work. Second question two, if I do all these QT activities, can I cover the syllabus? The answer is sure you can. Now, my own personal experience, both from being a teacher for over 30 years and doing a lot of educational consulting is that most faculty, with all the best intentions in the world, simply try to cover too much. And our classes really would be better if we covered less and taught more. But let's assume that you're right and I'm wrong, and you really do need to cover all the things that you think you need to cover. Can I still do that while using active learning? And again, the answer is sure you can. If you're concerned about coverage, then don't do 68 activities per lecture, do 2 or 3, and don't make the activities last 10 minutes each. Have them last somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. Right? I have some research I shared with you in those articles, and again, I could share more, that show that even 2 90-second activities in the course of a 50-minute lecture result in significant learning, right? So, do a quick poll, do a quick minute paper, those activities won't take any more than 4 minutes from your 1 hour class. The syllabus is safe. You can still cover all the stuff you want to cover. Okay. Those are the common concerns. That doesn't mean that it's yours. In the chat window, could I get you to share with me some concern that you have about using active learning in an online class that would inhibit you from using an active engagement strategy? What's holding you back? Right? What are you worried about? What could go wrong? In the chat window, share your ideas or your concerns. If you have no concerns, say none. Can it be adapted to graduate courses? Absolutely. And again, I think you can see for yourselves that things like a minute paper work just as well in a graduate class as they do in 6th grade, right? Asking students what they're confused about and then looking at their responses works just fine. Now, your graduate students will be confused about different things than your freshmen, but the technique works perfectly fine. Okay. Time management is pointed out by you. And again, I think for time management, I would say keep it short and keep it simple. Okay. It is applicable to a lab course. People don't tend to talk about active engagement strategies in lab courses because labs are inherently active. That is, in a laboratory, you are inherently not passively receiving information. The thing to worry about in a lab course is there's a difference between classes that are hands-on and classes that are heads-on, meaning many of our laboratories give students a cookbook and ask them to do a series of activities without making them actually think about what they're doing and why. All right. So in laboratories, the challenge is not to make them active. The challenge is to make them think. So when you're thinking about laboratories, you're already going to ask them to do something active. Make sure you're going to do something that actually makes them think, in addition to having their hands busy. Okay. There's a concern about student participation. That is, some students will participate and some won't. And that's a great comment. And that concern comes up in face-to-face classes as much as online. So what some of my research right now is looking at student participation and student resistance to active learning techniques. Let me share with you some of that initial research. I would say that research is encouraging. That is, when you ask students to do an activity, what my research shows is that by far the most common student response is most students simply do the activity, they report liking the activity, they report thinking the activity is worthwhile, and they report that if anything, the activity is likely to make them evaluate the teaching in the course higher rather than lower. That is, on average, faculty concerns about student resistance are misplaced. That does not mean that every student participates, and that does not mean that every student likes it. And that's true in an online class, and that's true in a face-to-face class. What I'll point out is there is no pedagogical technique that would engage all of your students all of the time. That is, that's just as true for a lecture as it is for active learning. So I could show you data that says after about 20 or 30 minutes of a straight lecture, about 80% of your students are checked out, and 20% are actively thinking about what you're talking about. If during an activity, if you get 80% of your students to actually do the activity and 20% of them don't, that might be annoying, but that's a whole lot more effective than the reverse. So I would say, based on the research that I've done and the other research that's out there, the concerns about participation are real, but the data suggests that in fact the activity is still more effective for most of the students in class. Okay, who still has a concern that we haven't talked about yet? So I'm skimming through and I'm trying to look for themes that I haven't covered. Some of them are about preparation time and syllabus, but again, I think I've covered it. Is there anyone that has a concern about the syllabus who's still unconvinced? Because again, I have two suggestions. One, you should worry about that less, right? But assuming that you still want to worry about that, don't, simply limit the number of activities and cut off their time. Don't, you can still spend 90 to 95% of your time lecturing. Is there anyone who's unconvinced by that as a response? Okay. Again, I'm skimming. So is there anybody that has a concern that I have not talked about? Okay, thank you. All right, here. So at this point, let me do one more activity with you, which is, I want to wrap up and review, and then I'll do one last activity to have you review. But again, the points that I wanted to get across today were, I wanted you to be able to define active learning in face-to-face and online classes. I wanted you to identify some techniques for actively engaging students in your online classes. And I wanted you to be able to list and address any concerns that you had about using active engagement strategies online, all right? In about 1 minute, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms and to have you kind of see if you can answer these questions as a group. Take a minute and study for that quiz in any way you want. And take a minute and either look at the slides or look at the notes or quietly think. And in a minute, I'm going to have Solomon put you in a breakout room to see if you can answer these questions. Solomon, too, could you put the link to the sheet in the chat window again? I will continue to answer questions in the chat window for people who have asked them. Okay, again, in your breakout rooms, your goal is to define active learning in face-to-face and online classes. The whole workshop was about active learning. Can you tell me what it is? Can you come up with at least 3 different ways of actively engaging students in an online class? And can you list one concern that people have about active learning and some strategy for addressing it, okay? Any questions about what I want you to do in the breakout room? All right. If not, go in the breakout room. I will continue to answer questions in chat, and I'll circulate around.
Opening all the breakout rooms.
Thanks.
You are still muted.
There you go. It's almost, I think by the time the pandemic is over, people will finally learn to unmute themselves coming back.
Okay, I will bring them back.
Thank you.
You are back, Mike.
Great, thank you. I was answering a chat question. Okay, great. So what I want to hear is, where, if anywhere, did people struggle? That is, when I sent you off to the breakout room, I asked you to think about what the objectives of the workshop were. You know, do you have a clear idea of what active student engagement is? Do you have some very specific concrete strategies for using it in your online class? Do you have any concerns that are still unaddressed, like where you don't have a strategy? So does anybody have any of that where they're still struggling that they want to talk about? Okay. If not, let me wrap up and send you off to enjoy the rest of your evenings. Are you seeing my slides?
Oh,
No.
Nope. Let me share again.
Yeah,
It's one of
Now
the
it's
annoying
coming.
features of Zoom.
it's coming now. Yeah.
Is that it? Okay, let me wrap up. Okay, so again, the main point that I wanted to get across this evening and the points that I want you to leave with is that active student engagement works. There's lots of research that shows that it works both in face-to-face and online classes. It's not perfect. It can be awkward, you know, but a lot of what we're missing in our online classes is feeling connected to other people, and active engagement helps people interact with each other and makes that better. The other thing that students, you know, struggle with in an online class is that sense of being cast adrift and not getting enough feedback. And most active engagement strategies are designed to ask students a question and give them some feedback. As a result, active engagement strategies in online classes have been shown to make students more motivated, to increase their retention in academic programs, and to increase their learning. So I know they seem ridiculously simple, but the research suggests that even these ridiculously simple things work. You have lots of options for things that you could do to actively engage students. And my suggestion from this workshop are to pick activities that are very closely related to your instructional objectives, which sounds simple, but people don't do it as frequently as they should. To remember that some activities are more effective than others. And so to think about the ICAP framework and to ask students to do activities that really make them think, to construct new meaning either on their own or with others. And then to also think about things that are honest to God better in online classes, like asynchronous discussion boards compared to live discussions. Okay. Finally, especially if you're like me and not a particularly huge fan of technology and feel a little bit overwhelmed being pushed into an online environment, I would say feel free to keep it simple and to use the easy features of whatever environment you're using, whether it's Teams or Zoom or WebEx. But you know, tools like Zoom or platforms like Zoom have a bunch of easy things built in, whether it's polls or yes, no, or chat or breakout groups. And if you're already using active learning in your face-to-face classes and you happen to be teaching a synchronous class online, don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. What you're doing right now probably works just fine. Okay. I want to thank you for your time. And I will see some of you, I think a week from now, where I'm going to give a workshop on student resistance to active learning and things that faculty can do to reduce student resistance and get a more positive student response. Let me thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing at least some of you a week from now. Thank you very much and good night.
And thank you, Mike. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And thank everybody for participating, and we see you next week. the same time, inshallah. Thank you, Salman.
Welcome, doctor. I will close the meeting.
Yes,
Okay.
you can go ahead.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to you.